Good evening. Thank you to the Refugee Council for inviting me. Thank you everyone for coming this evening. So as you know, we're here to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the 1951 UN Convention for Refugees and the 60th birthday of the Refugee Council. You may well ask why I'm qualified to stand here and talk to you about refugees or highlight the plight of refugees as a privileged Westerner. And all I would say is that I'm not an expert, but I can tell you why I very happily accepted the invitation and why the issue of refugees has become something that I care really deeply about. I lived in Pakistan for 10 years, and as you all know, in a country like that, there's great poverty and great, very evident suffering. 40% of the people there live under the poverty line. But the sad, kind of shameful truth is that you get quite used to seeing suffering and poverty and deprivation, and you kind of can even become inured to it. And then one day in 2001, I ended up in a refugee camp in northwest Pakistan, near where I was living, near Peshawar. And that camp was called Jalozai. And I'd never seen anything like it. It was otherwise known as Plastic City because the inhabitants, 100,000 new refugees who'd come from Afghanistan because of drought and civil war, had come across the border and were living there in plastic bags. It was the monsoon season, so there was huge amounts of rain. And I arrived sort of out of the blue because it was a spur-of-the-moment trip that I'd taken with an Afghan friend of mine who was giving out supplies. The big aid agencies hadn't been allowed to operate in this camp because the Pakistan government had said no more refugees, we can't deal with it, we've got our own problems. And that's probably true of most refugees. Most refugees are not wanted in the country that they seek help from. Anyway, I turned up and hardened aid workers described this place as the worst refugee camp in the world. I had never imagined that 100,000 people, mostly children, could be allowed to live in such squalor and degradation. They had nothing, no shelter, no sanitation, no food, no electricity, no medical care, and forget beyond that anything like education. I mean, they had none of even the basics. And because it was the monsoon and there'd been a massive torrential downpour the night before I got there, I came across several mothers who'd lost their children in the night, whose children had been washed away, babies. I also came across a mother who'd given birth to stillborn twins in the night, and there were children dying there and refugees dying every single night. Anyway, there wasn't much really we could do on that visit because what all the refugees wanted, most of all, they wanted everything, but what they wanted most of all was shelter. And the authorities had said, or the Pakistan government had said, they're not allowed shelter because as soon as you give refugees tents, that denotes permanence. And we've had enough of refugees during the Soviet era. And so no more refugees and therefore no tents. So these 100,000 people were effectively left to die in this enormous dumping ground. Anyway, I ended up setting up an appeal to try and raise money for tents, and we took them there. And it was the first time that I've ever firsthand seen the power of the media to do something very, very positive. We got there, we had this big truck with all these tents inside it, and they told us that we couldn't take the tents in, and then there were people in the camp begging for them. And I got terribly irate and rang CNN and BBC and Sky, and they came along and they filmed it and shamed the authorities into allowing us to give the tents. And when we were giving out the tents, I remember the most affecting sight for me, I mean, there were so many, and actually there was an old mujahideen who was helping us translate, and he was this great big burly guy who was in floods of tears as he was translating. But there was a 7-year-old boy who was the same age as my son then, and he came to pick up his tent and he put it on his back, and he was struggling to take it back to his family. And so we stopped and we said, you need a male relative to help you. It's too heavy. Come, go and get your uncle or your father or someone to come and help. And he said, I don't have any relatives. I don't have any adults to ask, because his mother had died in front of him in the camp. His father had been killed during the fighting, and he was looking after 4 siblings, including a tiny baby, and he was only 7 himself. And I think what struck me more than anything was that refugee children are not allowed to be children anymore. They're carers or mostly survivors, and anyone in that situation, they're just barely clinging to life. So anyway, that experience then led me to get involved with UNICEF, and I've been involved with, UNICEF has a kind of, is doing the same thing in every conflict zone in the world, and I've been working with them for the last 10 years. I was involved in their campaign for child asylum seekers, including victims of child trafficking, to be cared for in the UK and not to be deported back to the countries where they might not be safe. And I visited refugee camps in various countries with UNICEF. And what I've seen is that whilst the conditions and the political situations might vary, there's one common factor, and that is that refugees are not normally wanted in the countries where they're seeking help, and they don't belong. And it's I suppose, in my notes when I gave this draft speech in, actually, Ben replied saying it is important to note that refugees are not always poor and they're not always from far-flung places, and that led me to think about another more personal reason for being here tonight. And that is that I recently, in the last couple of years, discovered that my own grandfather, who is called Frank Goldsmith, who I never knew because he died long before I was born, but who I knew very little about him, but I knew that he was ostensibly the kind of quintessential English gent. Though in fact, I recently discovered that he was born and brought up a German Jew until the age of 17. And I was completely unaware of his German roots. It was kept a secret, and, or at least it was never discussed at home. And my father disliked nostalgia, so he didn't keep photos. And there was just one photo of Frank in his British Army uniform from 1914. And I recently came across some of Frank's old books at my uncle's house. And I was looking in the front page, and in the front page there was the name had been scribbled out. The original name, my original family name, which was Goldschmidt, had been pencil rubbed out, and as is fairly common, had been anglicised to Goldsmith. Then, slightly more intriguingly, Frankfurt had been rubbed out, and it was just decipherable. And I knew that 500 years of Jewish ancestors could be traced back to the Frankfurt ghetto, but I hadn't realised that my father was only one generation from Germany. And so that led me to looking in his, sort of trying to find out a little bit more. I looked in his scrapbook and I looked in his family albums. And he had meticulously kept everything that related to his Britishness. Frank, who had come when he was 17, had nothing from the first 17 years of his life, and he had everything which related to this this sort of reinvention, I suppose. And the only thing that was not carefully pasted into his scrapbook was his naturalisation papers, which were omitted. And there was also a moment in 1914 when the scrapbook just stopped, and there was nothing else left, and it was inexplicable because he lived much longer than that. So I asked my uncle why, and he told me Frank's story, which I'd never heard before. Frank's parents lived in Frankfurt in 1893. In 1893, unnerved by the increasing anti-Semitism in Germany, they decided, like lots of other families, to move to Britain. And from then on, Frank's father, who I'm afraid bore the unfortunate name for a Jew of Adolf, was determined his sons would become English gentlemen. He bought an estate in Suffolk, and with that came the title of squire. And the photographs in the family album are these kind of quaintly English scenes of, German Jewish Adolf in his late 50s, playing cricket and croquet and golf, or he had a gun in his hand, or, and Frank and his brother became quintessential English gentlemen. Frank, my grandfather, wore huntsman suits in the pictures and became a member of all the clubs and spoke with a perfect English accent. And his favourite thing in the world apparently was bread and butter pudding. And Frankfurter Deutsch, which was the dialect of the ghetto, they stopped using. And in fact, I heard that it was only when he was dying that he reverted back to speaking in Frankfurter Deutsch. Anyway, despite the hostility shown to Jews at that time in England, because there was, even in England, there was quite a bit of hostility, they were integrated and happy in their adopted homeland. And Frank won a place at Oxford to study law, which was a big achievement for a Jewish immigrant, albeit a privileged one. And after that, Frank decided to pursue a career in politics, and he became an MP for Stowmarket. So at the age of 13 years after moving to Britain, he became an MP. And, that was unthinkable in Germany at that time, because Jews couldn't join politics. But here there were a number of MPs in Parliament. And he also joined the British Army. He was well-liked and well-connected, and Winston Churchill was his friend, and things looked great. His integration was pretty much complete by this stage. And then came the outbreak of war in 1914. And pretty quickly, patriotism turned anti-German sentiment into a hysteria. Suddenly, being a German in Britain was as much of a stigma as being a Jew in Germany. There was hatred and suspicion for everything German. People with German-sounding names were attacked. Shops owned by German-sounding names were looted. Old people who'd forgotten to take out their naturalization papers found themselves threatened with internment. Anyway, Frank was fervently patriotic and decided that he wanted to fight for his country, which was Britain. And no one knew he'd been born a German, and there was no reason at that point that would ever come out. But in the first few weeks of war, a telegram addressed to Frank arrived at the local post office in Bury St Edmunds. And it came from his brother-in-law, Ernst von Marx, who was still in Germany. And the contents were read by everyone at the post office. It read, "How can you consider fighting for anyone other than your fatherland?" And within hours, the news had spread through the constituency. And although Frank had never considered fighting for anyone other than for Britain, and despite the fact he'd spent 10 years as a volunteer officer in his local regiment and was now a major, his constituents turned on him in a frenzy of spy mania. There were violent riots in Stowmarket. Protesters came to burn down his house with torches. There were violent clashes between supporters and his opponents. In the London clubs that he had become a member of and was very proud to be a member of, he was shunned, and his old parliamentary colleagues turned their backs on him. Frank was devastated, and at that point the scrapbook ended. The albums, the days of country squiredom, the aspiring politician, all of that ended in an instant. And Frank became an outcast in the country that he loved and the country that he was about to risk his life for. Anyway, he went on to fight at Gallipoli and later at Palestine, and by all accounts, he fought bravely. But he decided that he was going to leave England and for good once the war was over. And my uncle told me that his father had never recovered from the blow he suffered in 1914. He was a very sensitive man. He was deeply hurt, and staying in England was impossible for him. So he moved to France, where he lived and worked for the rest of his life with his French wife and French-born children. However, when the Second World War broke out, Major Frank, ever the British patriot, tried to re-enlist in the British Army again. He was refused on account of his age, because he was 61. And it was Frank's Britishness that saved his and his family's lives. After the Nazi invasion of 1913, they tried to flee France, and they found themselves at the port of Bayonne. There were no boats, there was hardly any food, and there were a lot of people trying to escape. And the last free ship leaving France, before the Germans arrived, would only take British-born subjects, which none of them were. And my Uncle Teddy remembered how Frank pushed himself forward, and he said it was the only time he'd seen him push in his life, and he told the captain that he'd been a British MP and a major in the British Army, and he had a British passport, and the captain let them on board. But Frank's Britishness also saved the life of Ernst von Marx, whose telegram decades earlier, demanding Frank's loyalty to the German fatherland, had destroyed his career and changed the course of his life. Ernst sent another telegram, this time begging Frank to arrange refuge for him and his family. Unlike many others, Frank's German Jewish relatives got out of Germany and survived the war. My grandfather's story is one of unrequited patriotism, identity and belonging, and it raises issues as relevant today, I think, as 100 years ago. It's hard for many of us here in this building, so generously provided for this gathering, to envision the desperation that forces somebody, an innocent person, to flee their homeland. Yet some here today understand it only too well, as we'll hear later on. And despite what sections of the press maliciously suggest, people neither willingly become refugees nor easily seek political asylum. To deliberately link those running in fear of their lives from wicked and repressive regimes with economic migrants seeking new lives and work opportunities is naive at best and potentially provocative. As many here know, supporting refugees is not easy. It's very hard to drum up support, I'm sure, yes, as you just said. In fact, it reminds me of when I was trying to raise money for these Afghan refugees, and I was really struggling. And so I wrote an article in the newspapers, and someone said, I know what you have to do. Get some photos of the refugees in Hello and put a starving dog in the middle, because the Brits love dogs, and then we might interest them. I didn't do it. Anyway, there is reason for some optimism, because a recent Refugee Council opinion poll showed that 8 out of 10 people believe that protecting vulnerable societies is a core British value, and that 2/3 are sympathetic to refugees seeking safety here. And that's, I think we'll all agree, an amazing thing, and makes me anyway proud to be British, and proud too that Britain was a key signatory of the UN Refugee Convention. And as Donna said earlier, the 1951 convention came about as an urgent response to the dire circumstances of millions of people in Europe after the Second World War. 60 years on, millions still remain displaced by war and political turmoil. And that's why this year the UK government must reaffirm its commitment to the UN Convention. The popular political rhetoric of tightening our borders must never apply to those fleeing violence and persecution. The facts are, the UK currently takes in about 4% of the world's refugees out of 15 million worldwide. Just 4,175 people were given refugee status in the UK last year. The Refugee Council faces 62% cuts to its support services for asylum seekers. With so much negative and misleading press, sometimes it seems that the Refugee Council is the only sane voice in a litany of anger. It deserves our continued support, and that's why I'm here tonight. Thank you.